I wanted to comment initially on the whys for us all being here. I think the first is we are all aware that connectivity improves the quality of our lives. It helps ensure liberty, possibly happiness, and it creates social inclusion and equities. Several months ago, our company decided to see what would happen if we provided broadband connectivity to villages in northern Mexico that are small villages, about 300 people each, socioeconomic class D and E, meaning household incomes less than $4,000 or $5,000, and it really did transform lives. I left one of the villages, got into the car, and had tears of joy thinking about what I had just witnessed. A woman who was actually doing Skype to her brother who was in a hospital several hundred miles away, families that were actually doing FaceTime over these networks, and children who could actually do their homework in their homes as opposed to going to the schools and getting connectivity through the Mexico Connect school program. I felt so strongly about this that we created a documentary. If any of you want to see that documentary, I'll be glad to send you a link to it. It's a set of interviews with individuals in these towns, and it is really heartwarming to see what the transformation was with connectivity in these villages. We have plans now to go to several thousand villages throughout Mexico, incorporating up to a few million people, and I think that will make a major change in Mexico. The other thing that I think is important to realize about connectivity is just the creation of opportunity in terms of new jobs and even new industries. Just like connectivity enabled a Facebook to emerge and radically change our views of social networking, just as connectivity changed the way we approach information gathering through search engines, and companies like Google emerged, or Amazon in e-retailing. I think there are many new kinds of content and new kinds of industries that will evolve. Not too long ago, I was asked to deliver a talk to the EGADE Business School in Monterey to their MBA graduating class on the ecosystem of entrepreneurship. And after talking through all of the things that are required to create an entrepreneurial environment like a Silicon Valley or like an Israel or like a Route 128, many of the students asked me a very profound question. Even if we want to become entrepreneurs, how do we systematically go about thinking about what to create? And I thought about that, and I said, why don't we just follow the money? And I said, let's take a look at the global GDP and see where expenditures are. Military global expenditures may be $2 trillion a year, but healthcare is $9 trillion a year. The crop and agricultural business is $8 trillion a year. Education is $5.5 trillion a year. These three things dwarf military expenditures. They dwarf telecom at maybe $1.3, $1.4 trillion per year. So I suggested to them that they should make the assumption that in the next few years, the connectivity will exist globally that will allow them to innovate in healthcare, agriculture, and education. But the key thing is getting the connectivity so that we really can create the applications, the new jobs, the new industries in e-health, precision farming, distance learning, and so forth. So the second question of why is, why are there still 3 billion people who aren't connected? In 1996, I gave a talk called The Democratization of Information. So this is 20 years ago. And what I was very proud of was the fact that those of us who had pioneered VSATs, very small aperture terminals, in the 1980s, finally had a global Ku-band satellite network and the technology that could actually cover everybody in the world physically. That's why I was very proud of being in the industry. The problem was it was being used, of course, mostly for enterprise, oil exploration, very high value things, some to schools, but almost none to individuals or individual communities. And the reason was it was just too expensive. It's exactly what Yale was talking about. is the backhaul was very expensive at that time. It was thousands of dollars per megabit per second per month, which was just far too high. In fact, in retrospect, the cost in 1996 was 3 orders of magnitude too high to connect the 3 billion people we're talking about today. 3 orders of magnitude. Now you might ask, why didn't the satellite industry look at that problem and make 3 orders of magnitude improvement? Because there was no incentive. They did not want to cannibalize their own business. And what it took was a completely disruptive relook at the satellite industry to radically drive down the costs. And I'll just give you a couple figures of merit. A typical $300 million satellite in 1996 had an aggregate capacity of 1 gigabit per second. In 2002, people came along, made improvements, a new frequency band was used, and Ka-band satellites were put up that had about 5 gigabits per second. Now, Yale was just showing that we need to get to terabits per second. So that would say you need 1,000 of these satellites to even start approaching the solution of the problem. Again, 1,000 satellites, 3 orders of magnitude. In 2008, the CEO of our company said, the problem is that the satellite manufacturers are not addressing the economics, that satellites are designed incorrectly, they don't have enough capacity for the money that's being invested, and we have to change that. And he realized that to change that, he had to design new satellites. We were very proud of that. When Wall Street heard that we were going to design our own satellites and launch them, in one day, our stock went from $35 per share to $17. They took an extremely dim view of a new entrant coming into the satellite market with the audacity to try to create a metric that could actually get poor people on the network. So I think one of the reasons that we haven't seen these 1.5 to 3 billion people connected is that the industry had not addressed the affordability issues sufficiently. There is also the story of regulatory issues, which I can't address because I'm a technologist. But I can give a couple of examples of where regulation can get in the way of enfranchising people to be on the internet. India, an example that Yale used, could actually enable everybody in their rural communities to get online, but they have 2 pillars of the new administration that are actually in philosophical conflict. One is Digital India, which is to get everybody online, but the other is Make in India, which means that the technology should be manufactured and developed in India. So if we or others who are not Indian developers and manufacturers can solve that problem, we find out that one of the obstacles is getting approvals because people in India would like to do that development internally. But the technology they're developing internally is a factor of 20 poorer than what we can launch tomorrow. So there is a policy conflict that would need to actually be resolved. Yale mentioned that Reliance, with their GEO program, literally transformed India from 2G to 4G. This is very true. Mukesh Ambani decided to invest tens of billions of dollars and caught the entire country sleeping with respect to competition. Yet, India has over 1 billion people with cellular phones and only some 300 million people on the internet. In fact, at a conference last year, the head of their FCC, R.S. Sharma, who heads TRAI, T-R-A-I, was asked the question, how do you explain this gap between huge numbers of people with cell phones and small numbers of people on the internet? And he said, without really thinking, it's an affordability issue. So even with Reliance Jio putting 4G, he felt that there was still a gap because they were charging too much money, and I hate to say this, Nicholas, he said per gigabyte. So I asked him, I said, what would you say is the right number per gigabyte where everyone would basically adopt connectivity? And he thought about 30 seconds and he said 100 rupees, which is $1.50 per gigabyte. And I said to him, if I told you that I could do that, what would you say? And he said, I would see you at 5 p.m., which he did. And we were very serious that if we could solve the regulatory problem in India, this conflict between Make in India and Digital India, in 2020 or 2021, we could ensure that everybody got connectivity at the metric he felt would create adoption. So there are affordability issues, but of course there are these regulatory issues. In sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere, there are electric power issues, which means we may have to actually put solar energy or other forms to power these things. And then there is just the will of governments to step up, find a champion, and fund these things. Those are the hows, those are the whys, why I think we're all here. So let's talk about the hows. And I'll try to present some context for why it takes billions of dollars, but not tens or hundreds of billions, to create this connectivity. And I wanted to put two pieces of information together that may seem disparate, but they will devolve into a single interesting number. Ericsson says that typical smartphone usage now in developing and developed countries is about 2.2 gigabytes per month. Again, they use the volume metric, which means that people in developed countries are getting a good experience with a few gigabytes per month, including some entertainment, because all of that is not web browsing, some of it is YouTube's, some of it is Netflix, but that's what people are doing in developed countries. So it says that if everybody could get 2.2 gigabytes globally, we'd probably have a happy world, because it means that we would have at least bridged the divide from emerging countries to usage in developed countries today. The other statistic is that the ITU has stated that as a goal, they would like connectivity to cost no more than 5% of GDP per capita, or earnings. And Yale, I don't know how many years ago it was that we met at Nicholas Negroponte's house, but I think you said to me that your goal was to actually put people on the network for a CapEx of less than $10 and to give a meaningful experience to people at $20 per year. And it turns out that the poorest country in the world has a GDP per capita of about $400. If I take 5% of that, that's $20 per year. And so I took seriously the challenge: could we provide a meaningful experience to somebody for $1.66 per month? If you say that Ericsson feels that you would have a good experience on a smartphone with 2.2 gigabytes per month, the number that pops out is 75 cents per gigabyte. That should be affordable to everybody, or a government to subsidize and give people a good experience. But is it doable? If you look today, cellular, even in India, in the densest cities, is not able to offer service at 75 cents per gigabyte. If they can't do it in the cities, they can't do it in rural areas. So cellular cannot address the urban-rural divide and get to these kinds of experiences with these kinds of numbers. In fact, satellite today can't do it either. Today, if you look at the best satellite plans in Europe or the best satellite plans in the United States, you will see that they turn out to be plans that are at about $2.50 per gigabyte, maybe $2 per gigabyte. That means that we need to improve the current state of technology in 2017 as quickly as possible by at least a factor of 3. And that says that if the state of the art today is a satellite of 200 gigabits per second, which is the state of the art today, not 1 gigabit per second, but 200 gigabits per second, we need a satellite that for $300 million can offer 600 gigabits per second. So our company decided to not only specify and design new satellites, we decided to create new payloads on those satellites. And we announced that in 2020, we will cover 2/3 of the world's surface with 2 terabits per second, which is getting very close to Yale's 3.6 terabits per second to give everybody some connectivity. I am guessing that within the next 12 months, we will announce a third satellite that will give us 3 terabits per second globally and cover the entire world. And it should be able to do it for the metric I said that would give everybody a good experience at an affordable cost. So the good news is that by 2020, 2021, technology exists that should be able to cover the globe, cover 1.5 billion people that are the target market, for something that is extremely affordable. And if you add all these numbers up, if it can be done with 3 to 5 satellites, which is a capital expenditure of $2 to $4 billion, and the networks, and if we put Wi-Fi in 3 million villages, or even 5 million villages of 300 people each to get to a billion and a half people, and let's say that local infrastructure costs $6 billion, we're somewhere between $8 and $10 billion to cover everybody, with not only the satellites and the satellite network, but even the Wi-Fi distribution in the villages. If I divide that by 1.5 billion people, it's $6 of CapEx per person. So we met the metric of less than $10. There is an OpEx. There's an operating cost to offer a service to 1.5 billion people. That would be the largest telecommunications company by far on the globe. And we have to believe that that's going to cost a few $1 billion per year to operate and maintain that network. But these are not huge numbers. We're not talking hundreds of billions. We're not talking tens of billions. Now, we are giving people a good experience, but we're not giving them unfettered use. We're not giving them Netflix, we're not giving them video streaming, but we're giving them a very good experience. So the how exists. In fact, there is a proposal before a government to do exactly what we suggested. Fund putting Wi-Fi distribution in 37,000 villages encompassing 10 million people, guarantee them for free a meaningful amount of data, every one of those people. We'll put the satellites up and go. And we're hopeful in the next year we may read that this actually transpires. Then we would have another story, hopefully as good as the Uruguayan story. So we know the whys, we know the hows, so who? I think that is going to be the interesting question. So let me make a couple of observations just on human rights, because I actually spent some time trying to think about this particular issue. The human rights of life and liberty are generally guaranteed, or should be guaranteed, by governments. We don't see very much private participation in ensuring life and liberty, because it involves security systems at the national and international level, and that it also involves an independent judiciary to guarantee liberties and freedoms. So certainly those human rights tend to be government-sponsored and government-insured. When we look at education, healthcare, food production, utilities, we sometimes see different countries with different mixes of public and private. We see countries subsidizing certain target populations where other populations are not subsidized. We sometimes see governments offering lifelines, like in numbers of kilowatts, or so many minimum daily requirement units for nutrition, or certain amounts of clean water. But connectivity is actually slightly different than both, because connectivity demands increase every year. We're actually seeing connectivity demands almost increase every 2 years. So whatever organization or organizations congregate to make this happen, to bridge the digital divide and bring the world fully connected, that organization is going to have to deal with this increased demand year on year. It's going to have to pay for the OpEx, the operational expenses of the network, and because the demands are going to increase annually, it's going to have to somehow stimulate or ensure that technology companies continue to improve the technologies to keep up with the pace of demand. So in thinking about who can offer this, I can talk a little bit about the attributes. It's going to have to be an organization that values human life, human dignity on a global basis. It's going to have to be an organization that either can expend low billions of dollars per year, that has the ability to organize activities into millions of villages and 1.5 billion to 3 billion people. And it has to be able to support sustainability, meaning sustainability in the maintenance of the network and also in the improvement of the technology to keep pace with this human right that has ever-increasing demands. So the good news is, as the Moody Blues would say, we are on the threshold of a dream. This is not hypothetical, this is 3 years off. We can start now, but we need the courage to put the organization together, or organizations together, that will go forward and bridge this divide. Thank you.